Georges Lemaitre, the guy who came up with the Big Bang idea, the Belgian priest. It is inescapable that many devout Christians were involved, especially early on in the scientific. And you can make a strong argument that the scientific enterprise grew out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. What's indisputable is there have been many devout, strong Christians that throughout the history of the scientific enterprise, the last 400 or 500 years, Christians have been actively involved in that, have made great contributions. So there's no sense where science is hostile to people who want to explore God's creation.
Jeff, welcome to Discover More.
Well, thanks, Ben. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Likewise. I feel very out of depth, but that's a good sign. So, Jeff, let's start with our common ground in our faith. So why isn't Christianity antithetical to science, contrary to many people's popular belief?
That's been honestly, it's just been interesting for me to analyze because I grew up in a home, my parents were Christian. My dad was a PhD chemist, devout Christian. My parents' Christianity just permeated our home. So this idea that somehow science and Christianity are antithetical, just a real practical level doesn't work for me. But I think what it comes down to is that often science and Christianity are portrayed as being different methodologies, different conclusions. Science is the logic and the reason, and Christianity is the faith and the belief and what you want. And when you look at the history of both, you find that, one, that distinction is not inaccurate. Christianity, the way I've come to understand it and the way historically Christianity has been understood is that it is a faith that you put in a trustable and reliable source. So faith isn't something I believe because I want to believe. That's part of what I love about science is that it's how do you find things that are true and trustworthy and reliable so that you can choose to believe them. And so I think there's just a lot of ways as I've walked through my Christian faith, becoming and growing as a scientist, where people perceive that they're different, but in practice, they just really aren't.
I think the biggest arguments, like empirical evidence aside, that people attribute Christianity or any faith-based religion as non-scientific because it's unfalsifiable, right? Because as you know, for science and a theory, it has to be falsifiable to be scientific. If it's unfalsifiable, it's an ideology. Any thoughts there?
No, I think that is true. And I think there's an aspect to where Christians have talked about Christianity in a way that communicates that idea. Well, I'm just going to believe it no matter what. I know enough of Christians and I know how I've thought there are times where I will believe stuff that seems ridiculous, not because it's actually ridiculous, but because I have been so convinced that God is who he says he is and that this is what he asked me to do, that though it looks foolish, I'll go that way. But that's not faith in the absence of evidence. That's faith in a relationship. In the same way, I will listen to my wife, even though it may not make sense, because I know her and I've interacted with her to know that there are places where I can trust her instinct and insight over mine, or what the data may say, if you will. And so I think there's times where Christians talk about Christianity as though there's no actual rational basis for believing it. But when you look at Christianity, even in the Bible, it says, if Christ was not raised, we're the most to be pitied. We're foolish. There's a whole aspect of Christianity. There are historical events that happen. There's a way Christianity describes the world. There's a way Christianity describes people. There's a whole lot of evidence that supports that what the Bible says about the world is true. So I understand why there's that misconception. I kind of even know how Christians have contributed to it. But at the end of the day, when you go study it, they're not that antithetical to each other.
And also, I think a lot of people forget that with a lot of progress made in the physics specifically, like Newtonianism, we've become very reductionistic, right? We forget that at least for humans, we're larger than the sum of our parts. And even the empirical evidence is interesting. Of course, I'm a psychotherapist, so evidence-based absolutely matters, similar to you as well. At the same time, empirical just means something that can be observed, right? And if you know how human sensory perceptions work, everything that we see now is optimized based on our evolution and other aspects that we have. So we're not capable of seeing and intaking all sensory input all at once because it would be very overwhelming. So in that sense, innately, even what we can observe, data or not, is very limited.
It is. And that's part of what I find fascinating about watching PBS and NOVA programs and stuff like that. I was just watching one the other day that kind of fascinated me, and I'm going to miss some of the details, but the basic idea is, if I as a physicist am thinking about my vision, thinking, okay, there's optics coming in, my eye kind of serves like a camera, if you will. There's some sort of detection mechanism that records all the data. My mind processes all that data, comes up and says, these are images. And it's remarkable how little of what's actually there that my eyes are seeing and how much my brain is interpolating between this very sparse data to give me a crystal clear picture. And it just kind of got me thinking, if I built a camera that just took a little bit around the periphery, some of the central stuff, and extrapolated everything, there's a whole lot where I would say, would I trust what's going on there? But yet, I trust what my eyes see all the time. I don't even give a second thought about doing that. And so, yes, the empirical is there, but there's an elegance and a sophistication and I would argue, a design behind the way we work that points to not just, well, let's just look at the hard empirical data, but it's like there's a mind behind how we work, so that this really kind of odd-looking system about how the eye works is something that actually produced trustworthy and reliable information in my brain. That's a phenomenal thing, in my opinion.
I think we watched the same documentary. No, because that's where I learned where the videos, this fluidness that we watch or that we perceive as,
right?
It's a illusion, because like stop motion pictures, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way our eyes works is actually you're seeing images, but the images are happening at such a fast rate, we perceive them as fluid, but it's actually not true.
No, right, yeah.
Yeah, that's how cameras are designed. But 99% of people don't know. You're like, wait, what? When you see the cars moving in the highway, you're not seeing them in fluid one motion. You're seeing split images, but they're happening so fast that we think we're seeing this video-like experiences.
To me, it would be very easy to look at that and say, oh, there's this vast difference between what we perceive as reality and what reality actually is. And when you start getting down into quantum mechanics, that sort of thing really shows up in spades, if you will. As I operate in the world, yes, I am looking at this kind of stop motion frame or however it is, but there's a fluidity that allows me to draw very trustworthy observations and develop explanations about what's going on that is remarkably accurate about how the world behaves, even though I'm sampling it very different than my perception, or what my perception of how it happens and how I'm actually sampling the data is very different.
Right.
It's like there really is a reason why I can trust what I'm seeing driving down the road, even when you look at the details, and it's very bizarre that the way my mind's actually working, but yet there's a trustworthy and reliableness to it that I actually think makes the most sense in a Christian worldview. Because in a Christian worldview, there is actually an objective world out there that I'm measuring and saying what it is. And it's not just the ideas that come up in my mind. That there's a reason why I can trust the ideas in my mind, because I'm made in God's image. If I'm not made in God's image and naturalism is just all there is, it's not clear to me why I should trust what's going on in my mind, even if I make some measurements in the world, because I see how these measurements in the world, the way I'm sampling and what I'm drawing is very different there. Why would I trust that process to work well? But yet it does work very well.
And that's one of the design or fine-tuning that we'll talk about down the road for sure. So let's go into that, where offline you shared with me that out of all the plausible theories out there regarding the origins of the universe, for us, per our faith, we believe it was created by this ground architect, the designer that we call God. You said that God's creation makes the most sense. Can you elaborate on this, since out of anyone, you are the astrophysicist?
Well, that's one of the things that, I would consider my scientific career starting actively maybe in the late 80s, early 90s, high school, college. That's where, I'm starting to learn information for myself. And in that And entirely in that time, the idea of Big Bang cosmology has been the reigning paradigm. And that's this idea that our universe started in this incredibly hot, dense state. It's expanding, cooling off as it does, stars, galaxies, planets, everything happens. 14 billion years later, we're here now to observe and figure out what's going on. One of the aspects of that is that the universe starts out that there's a beginning to it. And so there's this question of, does the universe really have a beginning or not? Or the two ideas, have it been around forever, or did it have a beginning? And obviously, if it has a beginning, that has those theological implications, because things that have a beginning or that begin to exist have a cause of that beginning. And one of the things that I found interesting as I was studying, you go back into the start of the 1900s, scientists thought the universe was static and eternal. It had existed forever, and the space and time in which everything happened were just static and unchanging. In fact, when Einstein developed his general theory of relativity, as he was solving the equations, the generic outcome, or the vast majority of those solutions, have a universe that's either expanding or contracting. About 15 years later, Hubble published a paper based on other people's measurements and Lemaitre's ideas about an expanding universe. And lo and behold, we live in a universe where it's expanding. Well, now this notion to get to an eternal universe didn't match up with what our universe actually measured. We live in a dynamic universe that's expanding. So people threw out the idea, maybe the universe is expanding, growing larger, and then contracting, expanding, growing larger. So there's these kind of multiple oscillations, or a multiverse, if you will. Well, it turns out that didn't work with the scientific data. And well, maybe the universe has been expanding and new matter is being created and it's still eternal. Well, that doesn't line up with the observations. Or maybe there's a multiverse, so there's not a beginning. And it turns out, it seems like we've had all of these ideas where here's a way where we don't need a beginning. But the universe keeps pushing us back towards a beginning. I just find remarkable correspondence between that idea and, in the beginning, God created, brought into existence the universe. So that's one of the reasons why I think Christianity is a great explanation. And there's not this hostility, or there need not be this hostility between science and Christianity.
And I think a lot of the general public forgets the great scientific contribution made by many Christians before, right? Like Jesuit priest, a sub-branch within the Catholic Church. And of course, a lot of churches have histories of not so proud histories, right? With a lot of violence, a lot of hypocrisy, of course. At the same time, scientifically, a lot of Christians were indisputably great contributors scientifically in the past. And
Absolutely.
So I think even historically, it hasn't always been this antithetical, contentious relationship that people perceive them as today.
Even beyond that, I mean, some of the greatest thinkers, Newton was a devout Christian. He put my discipline on the map. I mean, he's considered the father of physics. You've got numerous people, Georges Lemaitre, the guy who came up with the Big Bang idea, the Belgian priest. It is inescapable that many devout Christians were involved, especially early on in the scientific. And you can make a strong argument that the scientific enterprise grew out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. What's indisputable is there have been many devout, strong Christians that throughout the history of the scientific enterprise, the last 400 or 500 years, Christians have been actively involved in that, have made great contributions. So there's no sense where science is hostile to people who want to explore God's creation.
And that goes back to your opening response, where our faith isn't entirely blind per se, right? There is still basis within that faith. I think the best definition of faith I've heard from a Christian philosopher I had in the podcast before is your willingness to believe in the intangible based on certain tangible aspects of that. And at least with my faith, like there is evidence in my own life, anecdotal or not, in addition to this leap that I'm willing to take. And of course, you have more, I guess, robust foundation because per your missions, you believe that the foundational knowledge in biblical truth aligns well with your scientific background.
One of the things that I found in my scientific studies is that the way I see Christians have approached studying Scripture very much aligns with the way I see them studying creation. Among those things, one is that you don't just get to say, here's my idea, it's truth. it's like, okay, here's my idea. How do I evaluate whether it's true? I mean, Paul, even talking to various people, said, hey, the Bereans, they just didn't take my word for this. I mean, if Christianity was based on the authority of what somebody said, then Paul would just say, hey, here's the truth, believe it. Well, no, they were going out and checking what he said against the scriptures, and he was lauding them for saying, hey, you didn't just take my word. You actually made sure what I was saying aligned with what Scripture said. Well, I mean, that's what we do when we go out and do science. It's not, Einstein doesn't come up and say, well, this is the way it works. He said, well, here's my idea. How do you go test it? Can we be confident of the idea, not of the person saying it? Now, you can't get around, as you've established your credibility in showing the truth of things. Yes, I do put a little bit more credence in Einstein having an insight than maybe myself having an insight, just because of how good he was at doing it. But at the end of the day, science is determined by what the world says is true, not by how prominent you are, how widespread the idea is, anything like that. It's like, does it align with reality? And there's a lot of things that we kind of take by faith, same kind of Christian faith, confident, trust, and a reliable source that we take by faith in our scientific studies.
So I think you're alluding to like scientism, right? It's almost like replacing the Bible on the altar with this idea that whatever scientific finding I believe in, that's an absolute truth. Because the scientism with a capital S is, it's infallible. Whatever I believe, it stays that way, which is equally dangerous as any other, I think, non-evidence-based belief, so to speak.
To me, the big problem with scientism is that this is the only way to believe, and once we found this here, then it's inviolable. I think that's a problem, and I do think that contributes to some of this perceived gap between science and Christianity. But there's also aspects, just in the operation of, I mean, any physicist worth their salt goes out thinking that the laws of physics as we measure them yesterday are going to apply today, tomorrow, and in the future. We have a set of evidence that shows that, yes, that's a trustworthy thing to believe, but there's nothing that says it's got to be that way. We're taking that on faith. We're confident that because of what we've seen, that the laws of physics will behave tomorrow. But there's nothing that specifies that has to be that way unless God has created the world, because then God, again, bringing my theological thoughts on that, in Christianity, the world doesn't exist because it just does. It exists because God created the world. He intimately and moment by moment holds it together. If he were to withdraw his hands, it would tumble into non-existence. So why would I expect it to be so reliable and trustworthy? Well, because God is immutable and unchangeable and reliable and trustworthy, I would expect his creation to behave similarly. So I have a good theological reason to align with my empirical data that says, yes, the laws of physics are trustworthy and reliable. But if you take away the theological reason, there's no reason to think that the laws of physics might not just change tomorrow. Now, we have an abundance of evidence that seem to indicate, but there's lots of times where this isn't going to happen, and then, something catastrophic happens the next day. That's what happens with earthquakes and tornadoes and floods. We operate like, well, the evidence says, hey, this is an okay place to build. Nothing happens until that 500-year flood happens. Why couldn't that happen with the laws of physics? Well, theologically, I know why it wouldn't happen, but it's not clear to me why the naturalist would say it wouldn't happen.
There's a couple of directions, but since you referenced Einstein, obviously the father of physics, many times, so you talked about constant law of physics, right? In one of your talks, you talked about laws of physics don't depend on locations or motion. So why do the laws of physics change throughout the universe?
Actually, I don't think they do.
Oh, okay.
And that is part of that, and that's a philosophical idea. I mean, again, it's well-reasoned depending on your worldview. If Greek mythology was the right way to look at things, then I don't think there's any reason to think the laws of physics shouldn't change throughout the world, because you've got Zeus being angry some days, and Poseidon controls the seas, and they're capricious personalities driving how the world works. And so there's no reason to think the laws of physics ought to be the same. But one of the things that, and this is a little bit of a subtle technical point, but relevant to the question you made, is that when physicists in the early 1900s, late 1800s, were looking at electromagnetism and motion, like Newtonian motion, electromagnetism, what they realized is that in certain instances, the way things would behave according to Newton's laws of motion was different than the way things would behave according to our understanding of electromagnetism. And this is one of the great thought experiments. So I know that when I'm driving down the road or I'm on a train and I throw a ball, somebody outside the train will see the ball moving at the velocity of the train plus the velocity with which I threw it. Makes great sense, right? Except when you go into electromagnetism, light always moves at the speed of light. So you've got this train moving along. I turn a flashlight on. Does the light now move at the speed of light, or does it move at the speed of light plus the speed of the train? This may sound a weird way to say that, but what Einstein recognized is that the way we had developed those two theories, the laws of physics looked different depending on how you were moving. And that was the philosophical germ of the idea that he basically said, and this is Jeff Zweerink's paraphrase of what happened there, is we can tell where we are based on how we're moving. The laws of physics shouldn't be that way. What would it take to develop a set of physical laws that don't depend on motion or location? And it was that idea that led to the theory of special relativity, which accounts for constant velocity motion, and then general relativity, which is accelerations. And I can tell you this, every experimental test we've thrown at general relativity, it's passed with flying colors. And it explained some things that Newtonian dynamics couldn't, because Newtonian dynamics is just a smaller approximation. In the realm where you're dealing in low velocities and small gravitational masses, relativity reduces down to Newtonian dynamics. But general relativity gives us a more complete explanation of the universe. And one of the things that flows out of that is it codified in general relativity is the idea that the laws of physics don't change depending on motion or location or time in the universe, which I think is it's a philosophical idea, but a very Christian idea.
Man, that's fascinating. And also I want to go back to when you said the universe is dynamic, which it is, right? That's been proven.
Right.
Reminds me of in the Bible when the Genesis, when God said, let there be light and let there be life, right? The way he created life. Mm-hmm. Because as you know, life is also very dynamic. Mm-hmm. It's an emerging phenomenon, right? You're going from a single cellular cell of a virus of this, like the lower differential energy, so to speak, to a higher level. Okay. And we're becoming more and more complex, more infinitely complex and nuanced. So in that sense, I feel like it's also very congruent with the way God describes how he created life and let there be light, and the way he created life in his image, because God's also very dynamic. And I think that also, to me, based on this conversation so far, it aligns with, universe itself, the known universe is also dynamic. So is this life within this container of universe is also dynamic. So I sense some congruence there.
So help me as a physicist, because, I'm just sitting here trying to, so you're saying, okay, so there's this dynamic nature to the material stuff of the universe, the space, the time is a flexible, dynamic quantity. Yes, I do see that life has changed dramatically over time. Mm-hmm. In my physics mind, that doesn't translate to dynamic. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying there to interact with.
Yeah, I mean, you scare me when you say help me as a physicist. I was like, oh Lord, God, Jesus take the wheel. So what I mean by that is, even if you think about like a human form, right?
Okay.
Because like people say we're the highest level of intelligence or body with a consciousness. Of course, consciousness is another entire different game with quantum mechanics and so on. But even the way we interact, because it's a constant interplay. Mm-hmm. Like my consciousness, my knowledge, our conversations, it's bidirectional. It contributes, like your knowledge contributes to my knowledge and vice versa, right, hopefully. And in that sense, if you iterate that over time, what we embody is also the byproduct of the interplay, which is also very dynamic based on each other's exchange. And I think if you like extrapolate that over time, that's the dynamicness I'm thinking about, where we're not really fixed. Like our thoughts that we talked about, where our thoughts are not a reality per se, but our thoughts also shift and change and expand over time.
The immediate thought that came to mind in the discussion is like, okay, so there's the aspect of the universe. The universe is what it is, if you will. But in the aspect of being a universe, there's a dynamic nature to it, specifically that it can expand in this case. But as humans go, there's a Jeff Zweerink or a personness about who I am, but there's also this dynamic interaction with the physical and at other people that I'm Jeff Zweerink, but I'm also growing, maturing, stretching, and so that's the connection you're making there. I think that's an interesting connection. So
yeah, and even as children, right? Because like when you're a kid, as we talked about your father, right, with kids, like when we're kids, we perceive our parents as gods. Like our idiosyncrasies, whatever they say, the society, the religion, the church, the school, we internalized these instilled beliefs and we uphold them as truth until we replace that truth with additional knowledge or additional exchange with other people. Right. And eventually we mature and blossom into independent adulthood where we uphold our own truth. Right. So I think even in that sense, if you look at the psychologically, the stages of development and developmental changes, I think it still is congruent with this dynamic where everything, at least within our known universe, especially on Earth, is a constant exchange and constant dynamic relationship with one another.
That is very much the case. And, even just recently, I've been trying to understand quantum mechanics a little bit better. And there's two aspects of quantum mechanics. One, can you do the calculations so that you can predict what are going on in experiments? That's a very challenging thing. I've gotten a baseline handle on that. There's also this interesting phenomena of what is the reality behind quantum mechanics, because when it comes to general relativity, nobody talks about their formulation of general relativity. There's relativity it has a thought about how the world works, and that is very directly connected to how do we calculate what's going on. In quantum mechanics, that's not really true, because there's the wave function that everybody deals with, and then there's the how do you interpret the wave function and how do you think about the world in order to do the calculations to get what you want. But there's multiple different ways of approaching that all give the same experimental data. And so there's this interesting interplay where trying to figure out not just what can I do to predict what's going on, but what's actually going on. And the fact that there's this dynamic kind of unknown, got to mature, learn, and grow nature, it does seem like there's this interesting connection between the way we think and the way the world works.
I know very little quantum mechanics, but it's definitely going to come up, especially it's such a big, not a frontier, but it's a big discovery, and it is being uncovered more and more. And of course, you're way more knowledgeable than I am. But just briefly, since we talked about like philosophical aspect, even when Aristotle talks about like 2,000 years ago, like form and matter, right? Like the light. Light is simultaneously a particle and a wavelength.
So there's a little subtlety to how to say that, but well, because it makes it sound like it's contradictory. And the reality of it is light is something, and if we make certain measurements, it behaves like a particle, and if we make certain measurements, it behaves like a wave. And so I just want to avoid saying it in a way that's contradictory, because I find that a lot of times people will talk about Christianity that way. Well, how can God be one and three? That's No, the way he's one is different than the way he's three. So I just want to be careful how I say that, because I know that a lot of people will use that as fodder to argue that science and Christianity are antagonistic towards one another.
That's why you're the expert. So
I'm at least sensitive to issues.
Right. No, feel free to correct me moving forward. So on that token, especially quantum mechanics and quantum physics, which I know very little about, is also saying that it's in a way your perception or the entry point you talked about, whether it's the measurement entry points or whatever aspect you're viewing the light as a particle or wavelength. In that aspect, to my knowledge, please correct me if I'm wrong, quantum mechanics or physics also talks about that they're everything, right? They're both form and matter, which is what Aristotle talked about many, many years ago in a way, based on and I think that's where, to my knowledge, that's where consciousness or this greater designer comes into play as well. Because of course, we have a very limited understanding of measurements, as you talked about. Even quantum computing is very limited, right? We're just starting in that infancy stage. But that's why I think it comes back to the designer aspect, because how can just complete pure entropy create such a encompassing phenomenon in this container that encompasses things like quantum mechanics, quantum physics, the interplay, the dynamicness that we've been talking about? It's maybe I'm just not I just don't understand enough, but it's like mind-boggling. Doesn't matter what way you spin it.
It is kind of remarkable when I think about what it is that we've been able to learn about this universe. And to your comment earlier, the idea that we can think about the universe, but the universe can't think about us. If naturalism is true, there's just matter out there, and everything that happens as a result of the arrangement of matter. Somehow we can think about the universe. Mm-hmm. We're in some sense bigger than the universe. And again, I think that's a place where Christianity makes more sense of that, because we're not just matter. We're a union of spiritual and physical in the historic Christian way of thinking about that. I do find, going back to your comment about the dynamic nature and just what all we do, that even in our understanding of how the world works, science has often thought, okay, I'm going to set up this experiment. It happens the way it is. I'm an outside observer kind of watching what's going on. When we get down into the depths of quantum mechanics, what we realize is that's not a workable way to do things. There are few places where we can do that, but we run into problems because on the quantum level, there's no avoiding that me making measurements has now dynamically interacted with what's going on. There is no isolated system that's over there. There's this dynamic connection between everything in the universe. So my detector and what I'm detecting are intimately connected in the way, and my explanation has to account for that dynamic nature as well.
Let's go into that briefly, where to me, the undercurrent of what you're saying is like the oneness, right? Like it's truly, it's not, as you said, it's not this independent, isolated relationships. By us perceiving or trying to measure it in and itself, we already interfere with the process. We've become part of the phenomenon, so to speak. So like, how does the rise and the uncovering of quantum mechanics and physics impact your work currently, if any?
Well, most immediate impact of the work was some of the most difficult classes I took, and it contributed to a little bit of existential angst going through college, because I had been good at science and math always, and I get into those classes and I'm like, I don't have any clue what's going on here. And it took me about a year to figure out, kind of going from the concrete solve this problem to the more abstract, I can think about the world better now. And so it took me a while to do that. And I think that's just my guess is that's probably a standard phase of anybody encountering something as moving from the concrete world. I was immediately drawn to that connection when you're talking about, as children grow, they're listening to their parents. There's this concreteness. My parents are always right. And then as I grow, now I can move beyond that concrete to just listening, to actually being a part of the world where they live and seeing their world. And then I have to decide, do I agree with the way they see the world or not? It is very interesting. And as I'm thinking about how science has developed, and there's this concrete aspect of measuring the empirical data, drawing conclusions. We're now increasingly understanding systems that are bigger than anything we could ever measure here on Earth, that are more complex than anything we could get a real good handle on, and include phenomena that are small enough that they're incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to measure without affecting what they're doing. And so I find it amazing that we live in a universe that is as vast as it is, but yet there are enough handles that we can study it scientifically and get a measure and an actual somewhat understanding of how vast it is. And it's down at the minute microscopic level, these concrete, a ball is a ball, whereas an electron, you don't get to say, electron's an electron, but the ball is either here or it's not there. The electron, our description of it is far more nuanced and sophisticated than that, and trying to understand the reality behind that. But yet, as different as quantum mechanics is from our day-to-day experience, we've got enough handles to get us there. And I do see in the development of quantum mechanics, we had this kind of logical positivism or a determinism about we can do everything and we can make these measurements. Then quantum mechanics comes along and says, it's far more subtle than what you think down here. But that didn't mean reality changed. It just means our understanding or our misconception about reality changed. It's not just everything's determined and coming out. It's far more nuanced than that. And again, from a Christian worldview, the idea that we're actually having a conversation which is not just solely determined by where all the atoms are in our mind, though we may be interacting, it's just got to play out that way. God gives us some measure of free choice. What that means is a entirely fascinating decades, millennia, centuries long conversation in Christianity. But that it aligns. I see this parallel between spiritually, theologically, how I think, but also scientifically what's going on in the world.
So if we go a little bit deeper on that, on this container of conversations, with your theological knowledge and perception, is there anywhere in the scripture of the Bible that alludes or references quantum mechanics? And of course, quantum mechanics was not uncovered back in the days, but with a hindsight view and retrospect, can you maybe derive anything or references or any commentary that alludes to anything that's quantum mechanics or anything like that related to your knowledge?
My initial response to that would be no, because I think one of my contentions, and I think it seems to be borne out by a lot of theologians who think more deeply about this than I do, is that Scripture is written to be understood by all people at all times. So there's no place where it's going to reference bacteria or galaxies or these things that only in the last few hundred years have we ever been able to even begin to explore. If humanity is on the order of 100,000 years old, stuff that we found in the last 400 years, I'm not going to expect that to be in Scripture anywhere. And I would say quantum mechanics falls into that class of descriptions. So I don't find anything saying, oh, yes, we live in a world with quantum mechanics. But what I do find is there are aspects of Scripture that parallel what we're finding. So there's a wave and a particle nature of everything, not just light, but of you and me and everything. The way it's particle is not the same way it's light. Well, we find other descriptions of that God is 1 and 3. So it's not that it says, okay, because God's Trinity, therefore it's quantum mechanics, but we see these places where you have two things that seem contradictory, but they're not contradictory, they're paradoxical. And so we need to think more deeply. I think the triune nature of God is that way. I think that God is sovereign and gives us free will is another one of those, where they seem contradictory, but I think at the end of the day, they're more paradoxical. Quantum mechanics is in that class of, it seems contradictory, but it's really more paradoxical.
Oh, I love this conversation. So I'm going to make this tie with psychology, which is what I try to do. So another paradoxical truth is emotions are multidimensional, right? I think people struggle with the idea that you can be happy and sad at the same time. You absolutely can. You got the biggest promotion,
okay,
but then you lost someone that you love. You're grappling with both emotions simultaneously. It's not the grief overtakes and cancels the happiness. You're simultaneously holding the capacity. That's right, because humans are multidimensional. The concrete example I can think about is, let's say we fall in love, right? A lot of people don't know this. During the honeymoon phase, which is what we typically perceive as the highest happiness, the biggest dopamine release, oxytocin, the whole nine, but also your cortisol level is the highest because of the perceived stake and the perceived danger and the anxiety. Oh, can I trust you? Can I trust this person? How do I want to dance with this relationship? But that's also paradoxical.
Yeah.
Because you're feeling the highest level of dopamine, endorphins, and happiness, but your cortisol, which is a stress hormone, very simplified, is also the highest. That's also paradoxical.
No, it's funny because, not being a psychologist, but I remember kind of having been given counsel is, recognize that within kind of the first 5 years, I think that corresponds to that honeymoon period, not putting a particular time on it. But what I was told is there are times where that joy, the dopamine, it kind of helps you learn how to get through some of the inevitable challenges that are going to be there. And if you do it right, you come out of that with a far more solid foundation. But if you expect those joy, happy feelings, if you're not prepared, there's some point they go away. If you've prepared well, now you're set for a far deeper relationship. But if you're expecting this temporary transitional period to be the state of things, you're going to be very disappointed at the end of that. So how you think about that is dramatically impacts what happens at the end of that period.
Yep. And also a level deeper is the idea that I think it's a Western idea and it's a fallacy. Westerners believe that love needs to be effortless, right?
Where do we get that? That's a ridiculous idea.
I know. Oh, of course, right? Like we're in a committed relationship, but people have this, even the way we do our ceremony, the wedding, right? It's very love chemical based.
Interesting.
We expect this lovey-dovey feeling will last forever, which is a ludicrous, right? But that's another paradoxical where in the beginning stage of your love and intimacy relationship developments, love does feel effortless. But as you talked about just now, great commitment requires great act of service and requires tremendous effort.
Yeah.
A great book, The Road Less Traveled by Dr. M. Scott. He's the founding father of spirituality and psychiatry. So he's another one that represents spirituality and Christian, but also one of the most prominent psychiatrists of our generation.
Interesting.
But that's what he talked about. Love feels effortless, but true love is an active extension of yourself for the other, which is what Jesus embodies, right? And that's effortful. So love is both effortless, but also effortful.
You know, the fact that you made that statement that in the West we think love ought to be effortless. I see that the way it plays out. It's just so counter to the way I've learned about love in my growing up in my Christian teaching. You know, I mean, the epitome, greater loves no man than this, than one lay down his life for his friends. There's no, I'm going to die for you that is easy. It's a commitment. I almost learned how to think of love as more of a commitment than a feeling. Whether I feel good, bad, or the other, I'm going to be with you no matter what. And regardless of what happens, I'm going to figure out how to work through that with you. Looking at how we date and pursue a mate would be very different. Because if we're looking for I just get along, and that may be good, but that may not prepare you for what's coming ahead. Where if you're looking, hey, is this somebody that I can live with day in and day out and learn to love and care about, and I would die for them, that's going to flavor the way you think about who you're going to be together with.
So I want to pivot back to your field.
You don't want me waxing philosophically on? No, please do. Yeah.
No, I need to feel some familiarity with talking about psychology, but I'm ready for some more heavy waters. You referenced time a few times just now. So let's go into time. And I want to tie in the science of your background with the scripture of your belief.
Okay.
I know there's Jungian earth believers out there, right? But this is not a Christian show, so we're not going to go into that realm. So per your knowledge and topical expertise in astrophysics, Jeff, how old is the earth based on your scientific knowledge and also your theological understanding? So
as I look through scripture, I find it talks very little about ages of things much at all, particularly as it pertains to the age of the earth and the age of the universe, and even somewhat to the age of humanity. I think there's a little more weight that you could get on how long humanity's been around. So the fact that scripture doesn't specify, and at the very minimum, you got to do some calculations and some assumptions that you got to make. I think, to me, let's look at what the scientific data has, make sure we're doing things well, but I put a lot of credence in what the scientific community has said. And so in that vein, I think the universe is about 14 billion years old, the Earth's 4.5 billion years old, and humanity is on the order of 100,000 years old.
So can we dovetail into the creationism or the Genesis of the Bible?
Right.
Where God created, of course, days. That's the biggest argument or the contention point, right? How long is a day? Is it 24 hours? Is it 460,000 hours or years or billions? So can we dovetail that into the creationism aspect?
Yeah. And that was quite honestly when I got into college and I was thinking about that's where I really started taking my faith really seriously and where I'm pursuing my physics career. And so I was reading through Genesis, came across the notes in my Bible, these have got to be 24-hour days. And my thought was, well, if that's what Scripture says, that's where I'm going to live, because I'd become convinced that Scripture is reliable and trustworthy. But I didn't have a good answer to this question yet, because, science, I knew enough of the physics to know that things seem to be much older than a few thousand years old. And so I just kind of held that in tension for a while. And I encountered Hugh Ross, and I asked him this question, and he said, well, when you look at the way Christians have looked at how long those days are, there are some who say, yeah, those are 24-hour days. But there are Christians who are equally committed to the authority and inerrancy of Scripture who say they're much older or much longer days. And so I actually did kind of a study. And then the thing that helped resolve this for me the most was just going and asking the question, okay, let's do a little bit of Hebrew study here. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch, but you can go look at the Old Testament and you go get your Strong's Concordance and you'll find that there's about 8,000 words that are the entirety of the Old Testament are written in 8,000 Hebrew words. Now, 5,000 of those are proper names. So in biblical Hebrew throughout the Old Testament, there are about 3,000 words that are used. Now, you contrast that with the English language, which we're millions of words. So if I want to denote context between this and that, well, I will use a different word. I may be upset today, but I'm furious tomorrow. Whereas in the Hebrew language, there's going to be one word that the way it's used is going to be what gives the distinction in whether it's lightly or heavily. There's just going to be, it's not going to be a different word. It's going to be the way it's put together, something else about the Hebrew language. So it's just written differently. Well, when you go in and look at Genesis 1, what you will find is if you study between Genesis 1:1 and 2:4, which is the creation account there, that word yom that is used for day is used for the daylight portion of the day. So on the first day, God let there be light and separated the light from the darkness. The light he called day. Day is used for what we would term a calendar day on day 4, where God let the lights be for signs, for seasons, for days and months and years. What we now know as a 24-hour day. But then there's also in Genesis 2:4, this is generally it's translated as account or genealogy, but it's yom, that same word. So just in Genesis, you have yom being used for the daylight portion of the day, the full cycle of a day, or a long period of time. And the question is, now when it says the first day, the second day, the third day, what's the proper interpretation there? Well, oddly enough, the way it's used, that first day, second day, third day, the grammar is never the same throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Which, if different usage connotates different meaning, that gives at least credence to the idea that these are not just, these are obviously 24-hour days. There's some ambiguity about that. I would go further and say that different phraseology is indicating that, yes, these are not meant to be 24-hour days. These are meant to be much longer periods of time. And it just accords with, there are numerous biblical scholars who hold Scripture in high regard. The authority of Scripture anchors the way they think. And they disagree on whether those are 24-hour days or longer periods of time. And so if Christians, the church has decided we don't have a definitive answer, then where science comes in and says, hey, these are much longer, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, I'm like, okay, great, that kind of helps me. It's consistent, and that tells me that this is the better interpretation.
I had a weird thought when you were saying that, in terms of how Hebrew language is more encompassing and multidimensional, and also more dynamic based on the context that the language is being used.
I think specifically what I was saying is that where we use different words to communicate that nuance and subtlety, the Hebrew language, by having a smaller vocabulary, has to do it a different way, or we're going to argue that it's just a primitive language. And I don't think either of those that's not a sustainable position to hold. So.
Right. Latin language is definitely not primitive by any stretch, if you know how complex it is.
Right.
But my point was that even that, I think, is in a line with what we talked about, the dynamicness of everything. Because language is also dynamic. If you know how language is formed, it's another emerging phenomena. It's built on each other's context, historical language, the places, the locations. Just like, for example, concretely, the language of Japanese is comprised of aspects from Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Korean.
Okay.
Right? And that's the language. That's also interplay. And that's also dynamic. So even language, which is the most powerful and potent tool that humans have made, because a lot of archaeological studies suggest, we don't know this since all theories are man-made, but a lot of evidence suggests that the reason why we became the most dominant apex species is because of the acquisitions of language, which is the sociality. right? The universal truth is few and far in between. But one of the definite universal truths we know based on research is humans are social animals, and we need social relationships and meaningful relationships to thrive. That's
Absolutely.
a fact, right? So you tie all the way back to everything we talked about. The creation of language is also predicated on this universal truth, which is a sociality. But it's also dynamic and constant interplay with one another, different cultures, different time. I never thought there would be so many congruences, but I think it's fascinating.
Well, and it's an interesting phenomenon. You know, one of the things that struck me, just even in the dynamic nature of what you're saying, I was reading through Genesis not too long ago, and there's a description of the Tower of Babel, and this is where, you know, God had given the command to Adam and Eve in the garden to spread out and fill the earth, and they didn't do that. And then after the flood, there's this idea, we're going to build a tower, and we're going to make a name, and we're going to establish ourselves. And they wouldn't spread out. And so the author of Genesis states it as, and God went down and confused their words and their languages. And this idea, what struck me is that it's the words and the language. So it's not just, I realize that, you know, kind of to your dynamic nature of how it plays out, there's two aspects of the way we communicate. There's the fact that we speak English, and English has this vocabulary to it, which much to, as I listen to my kids, the vocabulary keeps changing. They keep taking words that I know what they mean, and they make them mean something else. So they're kind of creating their own language, if you will. So there's the words, but then there's also the way the language is put together. And I see that in that little case study there in the Hebrew language, is that where I will choose a different word to communicate something, other languages will choose a different word order or a different emphasis. There's just this really dynamic nature, but yet you can see the connectedness of all the languages at the same time.
That's the field of like social linguistics.
Okay.
I interviewed a social linguist a couple years back, but he talks about a lot of people are unaware of the amount of metaphors and analogies we use. Even in this conversation, I'm sure there's hundreds.
Oh, absolutely.
That we say subconsciously.
Right.
Or I like to use the word of like, what's the genesis of your story? But that's also play on word because it's a biblical word, but I'm using that as the origin.
Right.
So it's the same meaning, but we're using a different vehicle. Right there, another metaphor, right?
No, that's true. As to the best I understand it, a critical function of virtually all humor is that I'm taking something that you understand, using it somewhere else, and it's connected so you get that it's different, but it's also different so you think it's funny. I mean, I don't know that I would have ever studied language just because it's not nearly as structured as the sciences are. I do like the empirical, or not the empirical, I do like the concreteness of physics at some level. But I've come to appreciate there are lots of fields of study that are just really fascinating out there. So,
but the crazy thing about language is the fact that, as you talked about, different deliveries, but people get it.
Yeah.
That's what stand-up comedy is based out of.
Right.
That's literally what that is. Delivery of seemingly mundane words, but based on their delivery and timing and the rhythm and a punchline, you get this laugh or you get this humor or joy out of it.
Right.
But so even if you look at how versatile language can be used as a tool, I think that's another verification in terms of everything we're talking about. Fascinating. But I do want to go into time a little bit more.
Sure.
And I try not to ask like generic questions that everyone want to ask about, but this is I think a heavy hitter question that everybody want to know. Time travel. So I know it's like, maybe we'll talk about aliens after this, but we'll see. So like, what's your thought on time travel, if any? And the way I want to contextualize this question is, since we can even now literally time travel by looking back in time through stargazing and looking at the stars, because a lot of the stars we see might have ceased to exist with speed of light and so on. So that's the context. Okay. But what is your thought on time travel?
Well, we're all time travelers. I mean, we all travel through time at 1 second per second. Why I do that is I want to bring up two weird things. You know, we talked about space and time were dynamic quantities. And one of the things that came out of Einstein's development of the theories of relativity, his special and general theory of relativity, is that space and time, it's not like I have space and I move through time. I move through space-time. And one of the weird, bizarre features of that is that when you start moving very, very fast through space, how you travel through time changes. You can actually do an experiment, or we can't do the experiment. We do the experiment just in a different way. So the same theory that says what I'm going to tell you now works is the same theory we work to build our particle accelerators. And if we didn't account for it, they wouldn't work. You can actually take an 11-foot rocket, a 10-foot barn where the doors are closed, and as the rocket travels close to the speed of light, its length will get shorter, as in my perception, and it will actually fit through the barn without breaking either of the doors. Because space and time are not, you think, why should going faster affect, but instead of space being what is constant, my X, Y, and Z, it's actually X, Y, Z, and T that are constant. And so as you go incredibly fast, you actually move slower through time. So yes, we can time travel, which is not the question you're asking. I'm fully aware of this, but this is fun physics. By moving faster through space, I can move slower through time. That's bizarre. Okay, so that's the cool physics. Now, the question you're really asking is, could we do something that allows us to go and be at a different place in time with kind of a discontinuous, figure out some way to get there? And I am inclined to say no. Oddly enough, as you sit down and work through the equations of physics, you can't say that it's impossible. But there are some challenges that arise with that. I mean, and science fiction is just littered with the problems of time travel. I mean, I just watched Endgame last night, and they have a whole discussion of when you mess with time, time fights back. Those sorts of things. But independent of that, the real question is, to do that, you've got to be able to take this part of space-time and connect it with space-time in a way that's different than it's connected now. So people are thinking maybe as you get black holes, they may be a tear or rupture in the fabric of space that might connect somewhere else with another one. So instead of being able to having to take this long route, there may be a faster route that would, but even at that, I mean, even in all of these scenarios we can come up, there is no, I can go back in time. All I can do is affect how I travel through space. It seems like no matter what goes on in our universe, time always moves forward. We can affect how quickly we move forward through time, but we don't seem to be able to affect that we're going forward in time.
Can you elaborate more on when you said when you work through the physics equations, it's not actually impossible? Because that suggests there's a hint of probability there, right?
So the two parts of that I would throw in is that one, we know that general relativity is an amazingly accurate theory, but it's not the complete theory because it doesn't incorporate quantum mechanics. And so when we do the calculations in general relativity, there's nothing in there where you say, okay, if we do this, you get a contradiction of some sort, not just a paradox, but an actual 1 = 2 type thing. And so often that's going to be involved with, can you travel at the speed of light, those sorts of things, because where you travel, the way the equations work when you're traveling faster than the speed of light, there's just, the mathematics plays out differently. And the mathematics is what's driving this because we don't have a lot of experimental data up at those speeds or masses and everything, except for what we do in our particle accelerators. And so it's a notoriously difficult question to get at. Intuitively, we say, no, it's impossible, or no, it's not possible. But my statement was trying to say, can you raise that to the level of saying physics doesn't allow this? And as the best our understanding is right now, no, it doesn't allow it. Doesn't mean it is possible. It just means we can't answer that question yet.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I guess in some sense you could take that as maybe there's a probability of it or a possibility of it, but I'm still not going to bet too much on that because it's going to well exceed my lifetime before we ever get around to figuring that out.
Yeah, I know in one of your interviews it talked about the exception to the law would be a bigger being that defies or that is not confined by the law of physics, right? That will make this possible. But based on our known understanding, as of now, currently, it's not possible. Physics,
in all honesty, never deals in absolutes. It doesn't ever say, this is the way it is. It says, to the best of our measurements, this is what we know to be true. And so to the best of our measurements, you cannot exceed the speed of light. to the best of our measurements, we can come up with ways where you might be able to warp space and connect things up in a more complicated fashion than the way our space appears to be connected, or and our experience of how the way our space appears to be connected. But I wouldn't bet on it either. So
you just said that laws of physics, it does not deal in the terms of absolutes. So like, why has so much of our scientific inquiry or our avenue of understanding scientifically based on Newtonianism and scientism we referenced earlier, why have we become so reductionistic? Because you just said it, right? Physics do not deal in the absolute, but reductionism is in the realm of absolutes.
Anytime you're dealing with the world, there's always some aspect of how well have we measured things and have we gotten everything included in there. Mm-hmm. And part of what leads to the reductionism is this great success we've had in saying, I don't have to look at the whole system. I can look at this part, and by getting an understanding of this part, as I put more parts, I can explain the whole thing from the parts. There's been a great success in that. And there's even a recognition that, okay, the parts need to work together, but even that still has this flavor of when I understand the parts and how all the parts work together, I get an explanation of everything. I think to me, as I look at what's going on with quantum mechanics, I think that provides a greater impetus to be careful about reductionism, because the moment you start getting down here, I can't reduce it and look at this part. Inherently, my system I'm part of the system. And there are some remarkably powerful mathematical theorems you can show that once you're part of the system, there's a limit to how accurately you can characterize the whole system. So all that to say is that when you get down into the very details and to try and get everything ironed out, you no longer have this capacity to say, I'm going to put that system over there and study it. You become part of the system. And the moment you become part of the system, what you can say about the entire system does have some pretty serious constraints that we've been able to prove mathematically.
No, you did. You nailed it on the head.
Okay.
Yeah. Another through line I just sensed now is like confirmation bias, implicit bias, and echo chamber.
Okay.
Right. Because I think I would like to talk about truth seeking down the road as well, since that's what you represent, both Christian faith and your astrophysicist background. It's at the same idea where when you're part of the system, your objectivity loses its essence because you cannot measure the system as a whole, literally. Being part of the system, that's what you said.
Right.
And you tie that into the same thing with echo chamber and implicit bias. Like, I think explicit bias can be vetted through rigorous, like, cultivated practices, having different systems, evaluations. That's what scientific inquiry is, right?
Right.
But implicit bias is very difficult. That's what makes it implicit.
So just to make sure I'm understanding what you're talking about, what's the difference between explicit and implicit? Just flesh those out a little bit for me.
Right. So a concrete example could be like a otherism or let's say racism.
Okay.
Right. If you uphold a certain biased belief, you're thinking that I'm better than another person based on their race, and you're aware of it based on your upbringing, your instilled idea, that's explicit. It can be uncovered.
There's part of that in essence, by living in this world, the fact that it could be different, you're never exposed, and you also must have no way to see that what you're thinking could be other.
Right.
That sort of idea?
Right.
Okay, all right.
And then on that same token, implicit bias is just that.
Okay.
When you're living in the same community, everyone that looks like you, your families, the people you trust, your proxies uphold that same idea. There's no one to confront that truth, air quote truth you uphold. That makes it implicit.
Okay.
Right? So that's what I'm talking about. So in the same token with echo chamber, all of us live in different echo chambers, for sure. We're Christians, right? We tend to, not just us, but humans tend to gravitate towards familiar systems. That's just what tribalism and all that, right? Historically. So in that same sense, I think we have to grapple with this bigger idea that you, I think, talked about. As long as we're part of a system, we have to accept this idea that we cannot be 100% unbiased, whether that's through like a reductionistic conversation we've been talking about, or just day-to-day conversations where by understanding, accepting that we are part of the system, because that's what society is, there's always going to be blinders and areas that is beyond our consciousness or our grasp, so to speak. Yeah,
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, as you've identified, there are aspects of how the scientific enterprise is developed that help eliminate a lot of biases. I'll throw this question out to you because as I was listening to your description, there's kind of, you use the term tribalism, which to me has kind of a negative connotation. Maybe it's a more neutral term to you, but it's kind of like, well, I'm just doing what my tribe, I don't care about it. It has that flavor to it. It does seem to me as humans, we're caught in this kind of catch-22 at some level in that I need a stability and knownness so that I'm not questioning everything about where I live. So there's got to be enough that I can just take for granted or count on or whatever term you want to use for that. But by doing that, we're susceptible to this implicit bias where I just assume that this is the way it all is. And so the only way to do that is to find some way to get outside the system, which is typically interact with other systems, if you will. On the flip side, if I'm always interacting with other systems, there's almost an overwhelmingness about that, which means I don't, and I notice this in myself, that there's a pretty large bubble that I'm comfortable operating in. And when I operate in that bubble, things work well. The moment if there's too many things, there's too many options, it's hard for me to assess what to do even today. So, I mean, I don't have the problem of which grocery store, but, you could go and say, all right, well, I need to evaluate whether I want life insurance. Well, I could see this policy. If I listen to 8 different people, I'm going to find the benefits of what they say. I'm not going to go into all my description, but I end up getting into this paralysis where I could see the validity of everybody's position. How do I determine which one's the right way to go? And so we're kind of in this little bit of a catch-22 about that. And to me, I don't think that's a scientific problem. I think that's a worldview problem of, one, how do I be confident in what I've learned so that I can stand on that, but how do I also make sure that I'm continually growing and encountering new people? Or I would say, for racism, part of that is just get to know more people. That's what I loved about the Lord of the Rings, is you've got Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn are all very skeptical, and they're like, oh, elves are bad, but eventually they became a team because they were all, I guess they're not all people, but, and that's where I think in the human context, we are all people. And if I have this mindset, well, I'm better than these other people, it's a sign that I don't understand how God has created people. And so I'm in a flawed view. But, you get where I guess I'll let you talk for a little while because I've been talking for a while.
No, I love when you're talking. But I think my hope of sharing what I shared is I think the importance, especially now, to see common grounds, the common humanity, right? Because that's what it talks about. If you're only subjugated to your own echo chamber, you're not going to see the common ground outside of your tribe. Okay. And I did use tribalism as a negative connotation. Because tribalism is the root of otherism. Unless you're in my tribe, you're an other to me. Okay. Right? Because tribalism innately requires an enemy to unite against the front.
So it is a very negative connotation.
It is a negative connotation. But that was my point to prove that we have to somehow invite more diversity of thoughts. I think we're in this era where, of course, racial diversity, ethnicity is important because America is built on racial identities in a lot of senses historically. But I think we need to, yes, go through that and also go into the era of let's also consider the importance of diversity of thoughts, intellectually or otherwise. Whether that's astrophysics, you tying that with your Christian faith or otherwise, diversity of thoughts really matters. And I think that's the biggest gift of this podcasting for the last 4 years is I'm constantly in this diversity of thoughts container. By talking to you, by talking to another scientist, psychologist, physicist, or any other in between. And I think the only way to get a little bit more unbiased over time, as you talked about, because we're always going to be in part of the system, is to optimally, because you also talked about it could be paralysis by analysis, too many validity, right? Decision-making fatigue. So that was my point.
So let me ask a question, because this is, well, I'll explain why I want the question or ask the question later, but one of the things that is true is that when we're talking about cultures and people, there are cultures that they're advocating different ideas. So if I just take, in a simplest one, naturalism versus Christianity, the fundamental, they both can't be right. There may be commonalities and places of agreement, but they both can't be right. So now take that over into the scientific realm. So yes, bringing new ideas often contributes to the advance of science. I wholeheartedly agree. Part of what plays into that is not, it's not inherently that a diversity of ideas is good, is that the diversity of ideas gives you a mechanism for now, how do we figure out which of these is correct? So having a lot of ideas is not the goal. Having a lot of ideals, because that helps you get closer to what's true, is the goal. How does that play out over here, where we don't seem to want to talk about, is naturalism true? Is Christianity true? Is Eastern mysticism? You get the nature of my question?
Mm-hmm. That's a heavy hitter question.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
No. But I do want to highlight what you just said, where I think you agree. I think the diversity of thoughts, the vehicle to get to the destinations, to get closer to that true seeking, so to speak, right?
Okay.
But I do agree with you where if we're constantly only interacting with fellow other systems, so for example, like we're in LA, the mecca of palm trees and traffic. Right. The reason why we're the mecca of traffic is because when civil engineers designed highway and freeway systems, they only consulted with other civil engineers. So they thought, the best way to minimize traffic is by having a lane, 12-lane highway, which is what LA has. But facts shows that actually increases traffic because traffics are human errors, accidents, and so on. The best way to mitigate or minimize traffic is exit points, like diversion from the main way. But that only came after fact because they never consulted outside of their system of civil engineers. If they spoke with architectures, if they spoke with like traffic designers and so on, they would have understood it's not about the lanes, the quantity of lanes. It's about how you divert and how to reallocate the amount of traffic.
Well, yeah. So it's like you got to take both of them into account. Yes, more lanes does allow more people, but you also have to do. Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah, but tying to your question, because I don't want to evade it, from my understanding, my personal idea is that I think that also aligns with our Christian faith, because if God is truly, if he were omnipresent, all-powerful, almighty, all-knowing, then everything he designs would also have a place. And maybe we can segue this into fine-tuning argument. What I mean by that is by talking to Buddhism, different sects of religions, different scientific inquiry or sub-branches in Christian faith, I think through the vehicle of diversity of thoughts, we can seek out and identify universal truth. There are few and far in between, but there are subsets of universal truth, at least from my understanding. I'm sure you have your own.
No, I think there are,
And
definitely.
the more universal truth we can identify through like dancing and flirting with different systems, I think that solidifies our idea that it is intricately designed. Otherwise, universal truth doesn't make any sense. Like we had a couple universal truth in our conversation, right? Tying physics and astrophysics with psychology and emotions. How would that make any sense if there's not a designer or this fine tuning? Because like, how can there be universal truth that encompasses all these different systems and different understanding and different? That doesn't make any sense to me.
So it's almost like the fact that there are universal truths. In fact, some would argue whether there are universal truths. I know many naturalists will argue there are not universal truths in some sense because there is no universal source of them. Whereas a Christian, I would argue, there are universal truths because that flows out of the nature of God. And so if I get what you're saying, having those discussions help you identify what are those things that, regardless of your worldview, they show the way the world operates this way gives us a hint as to what those universal truths are. And you get that by not by being in your own little place, but by actually, the empirical data comes from actually seeing many different worldviews or many different systems.
Yeah, self-siloing doesn't get you any closer to truth. You know, you have to go beyond your silo. But even like the naturalism, right? Because like if you go into Darwinism, so to speak, like the idea that evolution benefits genes, not individual fitness, that's been proven, right? That's evolutionary psychiatry, evolutionary biology. But even the idea of like another universal truth, this is my effort, where let's agree that evolution benefits the genes and reproduction is the number one priority per evolution across all animal kingdom. So where the sociality comes in, which is a universal truth we identified and we agreed in this conversation, right? Sociality and being able to socialize with one another increases your possibility of reproduction, which also is incongruent with evolution theory and evolutionary view. Right? So that to me sounds like it is a universal truth because even evolutionary perspective and Darwinism fits into that. Like sociality benefits everyone, individual fitness and group fitness. That's been proven. So That's another comment I wanted to make.
That's one of the things, kind of going back to your original question of do I see science and Christianity as antagonistic, is that you would know the literature far better, but even my brief foray in is that the literature seems pretty compelling that loneliness and isolation is physically damaging, not just mentally damaging. And, I go back to Genesis. God says, let us create man in our image, male and female. He created them. That we are, not only is God inherently relational, that he's one and or three in one, but he created us in his image, that we are inherently relational. And if we're not relating, we're going to see not just emotional problems, but physical problems show up. That just, again, Christianity just makes sense of what I see the scientific data is bringing to the table.
Also the Trinity, right, which is the biggest argument by atheists. If God, we talked about this, but if God is all powerful, why does he need three entities?
Right.
My understanding is that's his attempt to help humans relate on a communal level by having Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Spirit.
Okay.
But that's also communal.
It is very much. No, and that's what struck me is that God didn't decide to be a Trinity. God is inherently a Trinity, that he is relational in his very nature. So he's not deciding to relate. He relates by his being, in his being he relates, and he's made us that way as well. And as much as I really do like working with computer programs and stuff in the lab, because when stuff goes wrong, I know exactly where the problem is. It's not that my instrument decided to be cantankerous today. It's not that the computer decided, hey, this isn't going to work today. It's because I did something wrong. And so I exactly know where to go look for the problem. But boy, when I'm working with people, I could do everything right, and they just had a bad day, didn't want to do whatever. It's hard, but yet it's also the most fulfilling thing in the world. So.
The last comment I'll make about the physical aspect of loneliness, the detriment, is the researchers give or take, right? But like loneliness iterated over time, especially loneliness gets worse as you get older and your age gets more advanced. You lose your meaning, you retire, and so on. Is equivalent to about 10 to 15 cigarettes a day.
A day, wow.
That's only physical, not to mention the psychophysiological aspect of loneliness and social isolation and depression.
That is ridiculous. I mean, it's... wow. I knew it was bad. I didn't realize it was that bad. So
yeah, it's a lot. So let's go to the table conversation about fine-tuning. Can you explain what the fine-tuning argument/theory is in terms of how our universe is uniquely equipped to support life within our known universe?
So I'll give the theological basis for why I think it's an interesting discussion is because when we look again at Scripture, what we find is that God created this universe with a purpose. Part of its purpose was to reflect his glory. Part of its purpose was to provide a home for humanity. So we can identify a number of purposes that God is doing to do that. So if this universe has a purpose, well, everything that we see that has a purpose it's put together in a way to do that. So your computer has a purpose. And as you go look, it's like, oh, wow, certain keystrokes do this. And, certain things you've said, I don't care whether it does that. And so if we apply that principle now to the universe, one of the questions we can ask is, does our universe look ordinary, like just kind of the way things would develop, or does it look like it's tuned for a purpose? And so some of the ways that shows up that I would argue, and that could be a whole hour's better discussion. But one of the interesting things, if you go look at the periodic table in Big Bang cosmology, when the universe first starts, it starts with just protons and neutrons. And some of those protons in the early moments of the universe, they fuse together, make a little bit of helium. But after about 4 minutes in the universe, the only elements in the universe are hydrogen and helium. Little bits of lithium, beryllium, and boron, but we can neglect that for now. Now, if we're going to talk about life in our universe, we need carbon. It's not like, carbon is that's life adapted to that. In terms of the chemistry that life requires, there is no other element that can behave like carbon. Carbon has an incredible chemical complexity that no other element in the periodic table will do. Now, if you look at how atoms form, they form by adding the next thing to it. So if you got proton or hydrogen and helium, you got to get up above that. But you'd expect barring anything else that you just keep adding. And so the abundance of elements would be hydrogen would be first, helium second, lithium third, beryllium fourth, just go down the periodic table. You know what the third most abundant element in the universe is?
Not even going to try to guess.
Carbon.
Carbon, okay.
So we would expect it to be sixth or sixth based on where it is, but it is the third most abundant element. You know what the fourth most abundant is? Oxygen, which you would expect to be eighth. When we investigate that, what we find is that there are aspects of the way the laws of physics are put together that prevent all of the hydrogen from fusing into helium, that enable stars to produce carbon and oxygen far more abundantly than they otherwise would.
Wait, that's part of the structural design?
Yes. Part of the way the laws of physics are put together, if the laws of physics were a little bit different, all of the hydrogen would have been fused into heavier elements. So the three, hands down, I got to have elements if you're going to have life: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, because you got to have water, got to have carbon. There are things we find about the way the laws of physics are put together that make sure that our universe has hydrogen in it, that make sure that carbon is incredibly abundant, that make sure that oxygen is incredibly abundant, because you know what the third most abundant molecule in the universe is? Water. Now, there's no reason we would expect that just looking at the periodic table, but lo and behold, we find that the way the laws of physics work, that's the gravity, that's the electromagnetic force, that's the weak nuclear force, that's the strong nuclear force. All four of those play into making those elemental abundances. It looks like our universe is designed to produce the very things that life requires. That's kind of the nature of the fine-tuning argument, that we see in principle, there's no reason why the physics had to be this way. But we see it set up so that there are these odd things that ensure that the things that life requires are here. Looks like fine-tuning. Looks like fine-tuning implies purpose. Purpose implies teleology.
I think we can end the conversation here, but I'm going to ask you a few more questions.
Great.
So just to follow up and be charitable to some other alternative arguments and theories, you said that if the universe were to look ordinary, which ours don't, can you give like a brief description of what that will look like if it were designed or if it were originated without a purpose?
Right. Well, and this is part of the struggle in the particular example I gave, is that to see what ordinary would look like, we have to ask, how could the laws of physics be different? And the problem is we don't know exactly whether the laws of physics could be different. And so it's not like this is just case closed, compelling, it's got to be a creator type thing. The question generally finds, or the way I would phrase it, and this is well supported by the scientific literature, is the idea that our universe looks designed is not a controversial statement. The question is it really designed? Or does it just look that way because we don't understand? So an example of a different example that, again, is going to be a little technical, but will illustrate the point, is that if our universe had a different geometry, flat, closed, and open, and I'm not going to explain what that is, if our universe was different than flat, none of the structures that we need for life would exist. Well, for our universe to be flat today meant the mass density of the universe very early in the universe had to be tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60. Nobody disputes that number is so far. 1 part in 10 to the 60, that's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 60 zeros with a 1 on it. Nobody disputes that does not look ordinary. Fine-tuning, if you will. Now we come along, eventually we say, all right, hey, our universe had this epoch of inflation where it just grew very rapidly. And that explains a lot of things about our universe. And you know what a inflationary epoch does to the geometry? It drives our universe exquisitely close to flat. So now what was this thing that appeared to be incredibly unordinary, now given a better understanding, looks like, yeah, that's exactly what we would expect. The question is always, is that real fine-tuning or is it just apparent fine-tuning? And that's a lot of the scientific discussion goes on. And I think as I look at it, I see that it's real fine-tuning, but others can look and say, well, even though I don't have an explanation, I think it's just apparent fine-tuning. Or we've explained some of those, therefore I think we'll probably explain. This is the discussion that happens.
The way that the universes appear to be fine-tuned is not in dispute. It's just whether the validity that it is actually fine-tuned by a designer versus it just seems like it appears to be so. That's the contention point.
That's where the discussion tends to happen, yes. A very wise pastor that I had early in my adulthood, said when you're making an argument, I was sitting there talking with him, and in a comment he made, he goes, make sure when you're making an argument to understand the other position well enough to argue for it before you argue against it. And I find that principle has been, one, frustrating because it means that it takes effort to investigate the opposition's claim. But I think that's part of it's a godly way to treat people. It's like, if I want people to understand my arguments, I need to invest time to understand theirs. And it keeps us from having dumb arguments where we're saying two separate things, or where it helps us actually get to the central part of the issue. It's like, if I understand the position of your argument, now it's like, here's why I don't find it compelling, here's why I do. We're having an actual discussion instead of just characterizing the other as obnoxiously as we can and claiming victory because I'm rhetorically more talented or you sound like a fool. None of those lead to good conversations. And so, there's obviously a fair bit we agree about, but I love having conversations because you're actually dealing with what's really going on instead of who can say the thing's the best.
And that's the expansion we talked about, right? Like, by interacting with different systems, we're actually actively expanding our own knowledge.
Exactly.
And our own truth.
Right.
Man, I have 14 more follow-up questions, but I do want to be mindful of the time. But yeah, I just feel like it's a really important point you talked about with your pastor that gave you this advice. And my mentor told me the same thing. Her name is Iris. She said that the only way for you to criticize another therapeutic modality, saying that, yes, it's evidence-based, but it's over-applied. It's not as valid as what the people think it is, right? Like effect size and all that good stuff. Only way for you to critically criticize someone else's theologies or modalities or theory is you have to commend the knowledge first. If you don't know a certain modality, you're not in a position to criticize that modality.
Yes.
Plain and simple. You have to practice that modality, learn it, commend the knowledge, and then says, I have adequate knowledge and competency to say it's not as valid as what the people say it is.
Yes.
And you have to be able to back up that. And I think in that sense, you're in a unique position because you represent non-secular Christian faith, but you also represent one of the most respected in terms of the rigor of astrophysics, right? And I think that gives you this unique standing, not just for media appearances and interviews per se, but to actually dive into both sides of the spectrum and maybe find a common ground through your positioning. And that's the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you. Aside from our agreements on our faith, that makes it easier, but I genuinely could feel your willingness to be a healthy skeptic, being able to be charitable toward other skeptics. Because I think this charitable mindset, attitude it's lacking in 2023.
The only comment I would say is I think if people adopted the let's understand before we respond, social media would become a lot more helpful environment.
But the businesses will lose a lot more business.
Fair point. But I just, whether it's good for business or bad for business, whether it's ever accepted, good idea or what, I can't get away from the fact that, I just look at Jesus. He understood the people he was interacting with. He didn't come up and criticize and make fun. It was like all the kind of tactics we tend to use today. He genuinely cared about the people. And part of why I want to understand is because I genuinely care about the person. And that's one of the ways I can show it. So,
and even a lot of atheists, and actually, if not all, the atheists and non-believers and skeptics, they dispute the actual origin of Jesus, that he's the Son of God, he is God, but nobody disputes that he was like a saint-like figure.
Seems that's my understanding. Yeah. That's what I've heard. So,
even a lot of historians are like, we don't know if it's God or deity, but we know he was a near perfect person that ever walked the earth in terms of his grace and all the archaeological evidence. But with that being said, Jeff, how can people get to understand you better before interact with you further?
So I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. We have an extensive website, reasons.org. There's just lots of articles there. We're always continuing to develop and try and help communicate the ideas we have well and develop new ideas. And so that's a great place. There's also social media, RTB_official for our organization, RTB_J Zweerink for me. Connect any three of those ways and that'd be great. So
before we close out today's conversation, Jeff, any last message you want to project onto the messaging board for the audiences?
I assume it's no news to say that I'm a Christian. One of the things that I was thinking about in our discussions here is I really do think Christianity is true. And it's not that I'm advocating for a belief system, is that I want people to know the kind of relationship with God that I have. And so part of the way to do that is to have good conversations, and I hope to do that. And I hope that maybe this would help some in the audience who could think Christianity is not an option to maybe look into it a little more deeply, because I don't benefit or in any sort of way profit by people coming to know Christ, but the person who comes to know Christ gets to know what I get to live every day of my life. And I just want that for them.
You don't get a seat closer to Jesus when you die by doing this?
No, not that I've heard of, and I get no financial reward here, no bigger house. But I do enjoy seeing other people get to enjoy the thing I get to do, the relationship I get with Christ. So
the fact that the universe is constantly expanding and it's dynamic, I think we as humans, we also need to constantly expand through interacting with different systems and different people with differing opinions, idiosyncrasies, beliefs. And I really think that's the only way for us as a society to bypass this current extremely contentious and polarized social political climate that we're in America. And that's why I'm really passionate about podcasting, because long form conversation is a dying art. And this is just my effort to extend that space and create space. And I appreciate your time today, your energy, your exceptional expertise, and just blowing my mind nonstop since the way we started this conversation today.
Well, I really appreciate the invitation. If you ever want to do it again, I've really enjoyed the time, would love to come back. And I think there's more to talk about, but I agree with your comment. Long form conversation is disappearing, but for whatever reason, I really value being able to just spend enough time where you can actually get to know what's going on with somebody else, because then you're having a real connection as opposed to drive-by conversation. So
yeah, we'll love around to talk about aliens and black holes.
There we go.
I really try not to squeeze that in because I want to be organic with you today. But
very good.
With that being said, to everyone who's tuning in, I appreciate your time. As we know, attention is the number one commodity in 2023. I urge everyone to check out Jeff's content, Reasons to Believe. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, I ask you to share this episode with one friend. Free for you, invaluable for us. And as always, I hope you choose curiosity over fear in the next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.